Well, welcome to the first Reformation Society meeting of 2025. What would David Livingstone say to us today? Isaiah 6 verse 8. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then I answered, here am I, Lord, send my sister. Well, that's not actually what it says in Isaiah, but that's the modern version. Because today it's a statistical fact that for every man on the mission field, there are 4 women. 80% of the missionaries in the mission field today are women, and praise God for every one of them. But where are the men? At home, playing video games in many cases. So as we seek to put feet to our faith, David Livingstone is an example of excellence. His life, his legacy, his literature continue to speak to us today. And the challenge of David Livingstone is most relevant to our times. And you'll see why this house is called Livingstone House, because we see him as an example of excellence when it comes to missions. If Dr. David Livingstone was actually available today, here, and able to come to Livingstone House and speak at the Reformation Society tonight, what do you think he would say? We don't need to guess. We have his writings. We have his published statements available. We can know exactly what David Livingstone would say to us today. It's what he said to the people of his generation. The salvation of men ought to be the chief desire and aim of every Christian. All men have the right to hear God's word. No nation ought to hoard the gospel like a miser. Do you know, statistically, they say, now, we've got good statistics for America, so I don't want to pick on them, but they do a lot of Barna research and so on. 2% of churchgoers share their faith regularly. And I don't know what regularly means, but I believe it means twice a year. So 2% of churchgoers share the faith. I don't know if that statistic's better for South Africa. I fear maybe not. Can the love of Christ not carry the missionary where the slave trade carries the slave trader? People are saying, you can't reach Africa with the gospel. Hinterland is unreachable. And he's pointing out, but the slave traders get there. If the human traffickers can get there, why can't we with the gospel? He had a mission agency write to him saying, do you have a good road to where you are? If so, we have men who want to come and join you. David Livingstone responded, if you have men who will come only if they know that there's a good road, I don't want them. I want men who will come even if they know that there's no road at all. You know, do you have a good road to reach you? No. Do you know how long it took David Livingstone to reach a mission field? 3 months by ship to reach Cape Town. 4 months walking to reach Kuruman in Northern Cape, where his mission station was, where his work began. 7 months travel. And then we just went to Carnarvondale yesterday, and Carnarvondale, the first mission station in the Southern Hemisphere, founded by George Schmidt. He is converted to Christ at Herrenhut, Germany. He walked to the Netherlands, walked. That's after being imprisoned as a slave for years in Salzburg for evangelizing Catholics. He was used as a slave, and his co-worker died in prison. He took 4 months by ship to reach the Cape, and then 9 days by ox cart to get to Carnarvondale, where he could start his work. You know, we went there in a day, and he took 9 days to reach it. And you can imagine it was before they built the roads either. Well, David Livingstone said, we must be uncommon Christians. That is, eminently holy and devoted servants of the Most High. Let us seek that selfishness be extirpated, pride banished, unbelief driven from the mind. That's from a letter he wrote to his sisters. Every idol must be dethroned. Everything hostile to holiness and opposed to the divine will must be crucified. Holiness to the Lord must be engraved on the heart and evermore characterize our whole conduct. I mean, that's a letter he writes to his sister. What communications are we sending to our siblings? We still have a debt of gratitude to Jesus. There's no greater privilege on earth than having our own chains broken off, to go forth and to proclaim liberty to the captives, the opening of prison to them that are bound. Now, these are communications David Livingstone wrote in his lifetime. Dr. David Livingstone was inspired by an optimistic view of the future. Like most of the missionaries of the 19th century, Livingstone held to the eschatology of victory, as opposed to defeat and retreat, escapism, and the whole paralysis that you've got today. I have people coming up to me saying, do you think Jesus is coming soon? And I'd say, no. And they'd say, well, I hope he does. I haven't studied for my exams. I mean, what a shallow mentality. What about the millions of lost people who need the gospel, but Lord, come soon because I haven't studied for my exams? You know, how selfish is that? Again, quoting from David Livingstone, discoveries and inventions are cumulative, filling the earth with the glory of the Lord. All nations will sing his glory and bow before him. Our work and his fruit are cumulative. We work towards a new state of things. Future missionaries will be rewarded by conversions for every sermon. We are their pioneers and helpers. Let them not forget the watchman of the night, who works when all was gloom and no evidence of success in the way of conversions chairs our path. Remember, David Livingstone slogged and sacrificed for 7 years before his first convert, Krishna Pal, was baptized in India. 7 years. Adnan Judson worked for 7 years in Burma, burying some of his children in that time, before he had his first convert. And I think Robert Morrison, the first Protestant missionary to China, also had 7 years before he won his first convert. Can you imagine any mission being able to survive? You know, we've worked for 7 years on a single convert. They'd lose all their support. The church would excommunicate them. They'd be penniless on the streets before that went on. I don't know of any church today who could endure 7 years before you get your first fruits. They will doubtless have more light than we, but we serve our master earnestly, and we proclaim the same gospel as they will do. Now, it's true, David Livingstone preached the gospel many times before he saw his first converts. But we might sometimes have the joy of winning several converts in a single outreach. We had the joy a few weeks ago when we did the evangelism seminar here, went to Sea Point. There were probably a dozen people that were prayed for by our different team members in a single day. These poor early pioneer missionaries, they slogged for years before they saw fruit. In his diary, he wrote, "A quiet audience today. The seed is being sown, the least of all seeds now, but it will grow into a mighty tree. It is as if it were a small stone cut out of the mountain, but it will fill the whole earth." There he's referring to Daniel's vision of a stone coming out and striking the statue that symbolized all the empires of the world, and the statue crumbled to dust. The wind blew the dust away, and that stone grew to be a mountain that filled the whole earth. A vision of the victory of the kingdom of God. We work for a glorious future, which we are not destined to see. The golden age which has not yet been, but which will yet be. We are only morning stars shining in the dark. But the glorious morn will break, the good time coming yet. The dominion has been given by the power of commerce and population unto the people of the saints of the Most High. This is an everlasting kingdom, a little stone cut out of the mountain without hands, which will cover the whole earth. For this time we work. By different agencies, the great ruler is bringing all things into a focus. Jesus is gathering all things to himself. He is daily becoming more and more the center of the world's hopes and of the world's fears. Today, there are over 680 million people in Africa who claim to be Christians. This is according to Operation World. This includes 150 million Protestants, 50 million Anglicans, 140 million Charismatics, 60 million Pentecostals, and more than 100 million Independents. By the way, there's more Anglicans in church every Sunday in Nigeria, 18 times more, than there are in the whole of the British Isles and North America combined. You can add Australia and New Zealand, that doesn't make much difference. There's millions more Anglicans in church in Uganda every Sunday than there are in the whole of the rest of the English-speaking world. It's just staggering, the growth in Africa. David Livingstone plowed in rocky ground, stony ground. He sowed gospel seed that has produced this great harvest. When David Livingstone came to Africa, there were 5 million Christians in all of Africa. Most of those were up in Egypt and Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was called then, with a little group of Christians at the Cape of Good Hope. The rest of Africa was unreached. But Psalm 22 verse 27 inspired him. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. Well, David Livingstone changed my life, his life and legacy. As a new Christian, I imbibed many of the presuppositions and tendencies of churches in the 1970s. I was converted in 1977 when the late great Planet Earth and There's a New World Coming, Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth. Hal Lindsey's books were the main thing going out there. We were watching films like A Thief and a Night and A Distant Thunder. We were singing I Wish We'd All Been Ready by Larry Norman. And I was obsessed with these date-setting end times rapture fever publications. I was convinced the Lord would come before the end of 1977, 1978, 1979, 1980. 1981, the planets are lining up. There's no doubt that the end's coming in 1981. We are the terminal generation. I was saved. I did love the Lord. I was evangelistic. I was enthusiastically involved in evangelism. But my understanding of biblical doctrines was actually quite shallow. And I imbibed the prevailing prejudice against Calvinism. I was convinced we're living in the last days, and therefore I was dead set against marriage, Bible college, having children. Couldn't even think of it. There wasn't enough time. We're living in the last days, not the last days, the last minutes, the last seconds. We were the terminal generation. This is the end of the world, imminently. We thought like that in the 1970s. I wasn't the only one. I couldn't allow myself to be distracted by such worldly matters as family, raising children. I had to devote the last few days on earth to snatching souls from the fire. That was my vision. I couldn't think beyond a few months. I couldn't plan for next year. We weren't going to be here next year. And you wonder why there's so few pictures of the early days of Frontline Fellowship or mission in the army. Well, what was the point of accumulating pictures? There was no future to plan for. The rapture was coming, surely before the end of that year. I was completely closed to the idea of theological training. What's the point? The Lord will have come before I've even finished my studies. Better to stay in the field winning souls in these last few days remaining. Then I read The Puritan Hope. I distinctly remember finding this book in 1980. I ran a book table in the army. Interestingly, you may not think it sounds impressive, but I sold over 600 rands worth of books from my bunk and my trommel. But when I tell you the average paperback was 50 cents and the average hardcover book was 2 rand, that's a lot of books and Bibles to sell without a shop, just from my bed and from my trommel, my trunk. And we got good books, and The Puritan Hope was one of them. And this was written by Ian Murray, published by Band of Truth. They produced very good books. This book informed me all of the pioneer missionaries of the 19th century missionary movement were Calvinist and postmillennial. Not that I could spell either of them. I had no idea what postmillennialism was, but when I read that the father of modern missions, William Carey, and the best friend Africa ever had, Dr. David Livingstone, that they were both reformed and postmill, I determined I must read up on these matters. And we've got some of the first editions of their publications downstairs in the reception area behind the glass. Earlier, I'd read a thin modern biography on David Livingstone, but it didn't seem too extraordinary because, like most modern books that you get in an average Christian bookshop, it was sanitized. What I mean by sanitized, all controversial, politically incorrect details had been omitted. So the modern censored versions of Livingstone's life didn't mention the ravages of the Islamic slave trade, which David Livingstone not only confronted, but documented and fought against. David Livingstone opened fire on slave traders and set captives free. You can't put that into modern mission biographies. It would be a scandal. I mean, David Livingstone shooting people, okay, there might be Arab slave traders who had massacred whole villages, but somehow or another, you're not meant to think of missionaries doing things like that. It left out his Calvinist convictions, which is not very popular anymore, and his post-millennial eschatology of victory. Why bother anyone with that detail when we all know we're living in last days and the rapture's coming any moment? The modern biographies left out the fact that David Livingstone in the 1840s carried a 6-barreled revolver and a double-barreled rifle. I mean, this is high technology for that time. His violent confrontations with Islamic slave traders, his bold initiatives to set thousands of captives free, were too controversial to include in modern, abridged, sanitized versions of Livingstone's life, which is why I don't go shopping in Christian bookshops normally. I go in second-hand bookshops and find old editions before the politically correct censorship nonsense. I've always been a bookworm. I've had a love for history. And finding most of the books available in the average bookshop quite shallow, quite predictable and repetitive, I might add, I've developed a preference for scouring through second-hand bookshops, finding these rare old first editions of these missionaries and these pioneers. Just to give you an example, I was speaking at a Hospital Christian Fellowship conference some time ago, and I said, as C.T. Studd said, you only have one life, it'll soon be past, only what's done for Christ will last. And somebody piped up and said, no, I checked in Google, it's only what's done for God will last. I said, ma'am, I've got first editions of C.T. Studd's books. It's only what's done for Christ will last. She said, no, but I checked in Google. It's only what's done for God will last. I said, Google does not predate the first edition of William Carey's books published in the 1790s. I've got original first editions of these books. I can assure you it was only what's done for Christ will last. No, but I checked with Google. Who the hell is Google? I mean, what have they got to do with history? What do they know? They only know what the programmer put in. And so to think that you've got people today who think that Google is a better authority than a first edition of the actual person who said the statements in the first place. But that's a minor example of how you can have people today who will think that Wikipedia's got the facts and that you can get the first edition of that person's book and that doesn't carry as much authority. Now, I was reading Livingstone's missionary travels as I was following in much of his footsteps in the Tet province of Mozambique in the Zambezi Valley in 1989. And it was uncanny. I was leading a medical team from America. We were captured by Russian forces. We were imprisoned in SNASP security prison in Mashava in Maputo. And that was the book I was reading. And it's extraordinary how it was so much the same. What Livingstone was describing about Mozambique back in the 1850s could describe Mozambique in the 1980s. And bodies floating down the river and burning villages. And it's just extraordinary, the similarities. And I discussed that even with the British ambassador in Maputo before I was flown out of the country. What I learned from the writings and from the exemplary life of the legacy of David Livingstone transformed my life and ministry. So what did I learn from David Livingstone? I learned from David Livingstone the importance of discipline. He was disciplined in reading. He redeemed the time. He was disciplined in exercise. When I say exercise, he was working in the cotton mills, walking an average of 32 kilometers a day, amidst and above and balanced over the cotton machinery in the factories. He chose to walk to a college every day, miles in the snow, in winter, of course, Scotland. He had to go from his hometown through to Glasgow, where he was studying, and he would refuse lifts on carts, people riding past, because he wanted to keep his muscles strong for the mission field in Africa. He walked across Africa, from one side to the other, from coast to coast, from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. To think he abstained from alcohol for life. He was a teetotaler. He was temperate. He was duty-oriented. He was hardworking. Livingstone's work ethic is a rebuke to all of us. From age 10, he worked 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, walking an average of 34 kilometers a day, much of it crawling, stooping amongst and over the machinery, or even balancing over it. Imagine the tremendous physical training this was for his later transcontinental expeditions throughout Africa. This he did in the steamed heat and humidity considered essential for the production of thread. I mean, that's quite a physical training program. He didn't need a gym membership, in other words. And David used his first week's wages to purchase a book on Latin, age 10. Now, what did you spend your first wage on? When I was 17 and I got my first salary check, I'd been working at the Old Mutual. You might be amazed to know it was actually running a computer that was bigger than this house, the ICL 2980. I had the midnight shift. Well, when I got my first salary, I went and bought a suit. I remember the price. The suit cost 17 Rand. And with the tie and belt, that was another. In fact, I remember the tie, I think, was 75 cents. And the belt, I think, was 2 Rand 25, something like that. So for 20 Rand, I got a suit, a belt, and a tie. 20 Rand. Just to remind you that our Rand used to be worth a lot more. And then I bought a black briefcase and a black umbrella. And if I'm not mistaken, the umbrella was 1 Rand 50, and the briefcase might have been 2 Rand 50. And that was a nice black leather type of briefcase. Imitation leather for sure, but still. It just shows the buying power. But David Livingstone spent his first salary buying a book on Latin, Rudiments of Latin. And less than 10% of the children who worked at cotton mills ever learned to read or write. By the way, this picture's imagination. They didn't have a second room in their home. His mom did find him reading late, but they didn't have a table out. I'll show you just now how this picture's actually impossible, but still. David not only learned to read and write, he taught himself Latin and Greek and Hebrew. Every night after work, he would attend a night school from 8 to 10 p.m. And he would study, often until midnight. Every morning began at 5:30 a.m. when the bell rang and everyone had to get out the tenement and get to work in the cotton mill. His workday started at 6 a.m. And just another story about early David Livingstone. He is age 9, and his mother kept him out of the mill as long as she could. Most kids started to work in a cotton mill at age 6, but she kept him out longer that he could learn to read and to enlarge his reading. So he's on the banks of the river, and he's suddenly startled by a little girl screams. And he sees the little girl's having an adventure with a baby brother, and her toddler brother and her were in a boat, and they'd just lost the oar. And the paddle wheel of the mill was drawing the boat towards it, where the boat would obviously be crushed along with the kids. And David didn't hesitate. He plunged into the icy river. He saved this little girl and a brother and didn't say a word about it. You don't read about it in his books or anything. The only reason we know about that is his father was required to write a testimonial for his son, and he mentioned this incident, and the only reason that dad knew about it is because the parents of the little girl and baby boy came round to their home later that night and thanked them for what their son had done. And they were surprised because he didn't mention it. And this testimonial was found recently in the London Missionary Society's attic in London, which was basically catching cobwebs and dust. And just an anecdote from history, which people wouldn't even know about, except for the fact that a bit of archaeological excavations in the attic dug it out. Now, when David was studying medicine and theology, he would walk from Blantyre to Glasgow, refusing every offer of a ride on a horse and cart passing by. He preferred the 4-hour walk, 4 hours walk in the snow in winter, in order to strengthen his muscles for his chosen career in missions. He was physically fit from his work in a cotton mill, but now he didn't want to go into sedentary activity now that he is a theological and medical student. Now, David never accepted charity. I've read garbage out there and heard some experts in David Livingstone say Livingstone got a bursary to study medicine. There were no bursaries back then. I mean, what do you think this is? We talk about the 1830s here. And he never accepted charity. His family were dead set against accepting charity. Although he was brought up in the poorest of circumstances, where a family of 7 was forced to live in a single room, this room, 10 feet by 14 feet. No electricity, no plumbing, no running water. The mattresses were stored under the parents' bed, which was set in the wall. And so at night they would have put the mattresses out for his brother and his sisters to sleep on the floor. So there was no table where he could be sitting reading by candlelight for the mother coming from another door to say, "Why are you up so late?" Although she did find him reading late, and she'd sometimes have to confiscate his candle to get him to go to sleep. He worked and saved to put himself through college, both medical school and theological college. David was the first worker from the cotton mills to ever receive a university education, and no one gave it to him. He earned it, and he passed it with high honors. He received his doctorate from the Royal Faculty of Physicians and Surgeons in November 1840. He was ordained as a congregational minister 20th of November 1840. And I might say that when they evaluated him, they said that they were graduating him as a surgeon despite his unorthodox views. He had this strange idea that a stethoscope could be a useful medical instrument. I mean, all doctors today wear it like a medal around their chest, but stethoscopes were considered a new fad back in the 1830s, and they thought it was worth mentioning that this was a weakness. He actually thought the stethoscope was of medical benefit. Now, against all odds, David had achieved far more than anyone would have thought possible. He was born in such a poverty-stricken and disadvantaged background. I know a lot of people who are poverty-stricken and from a disadvantaged background. I don't think I know anyone who is more poverty-stricken and disadvantaged than David Livingstone was. He lived in a tenement without electricity, without plumbing, with no indoor plumbing at all. In fact, the only water flowed from this pump in the courtyard. This was the tenement where they shared with, was it another 24 families? And I've had some people say this picture's of David Livingstone's house. Not quite. It's of the tenement block of flats where his family had a top floor on the third floor corner room, single room. His brother and him had to go down the stairs multiple times to come out for every drop of water they need for cooking, washing, for drinking. It all had to be carried from this pump down in the courtyard. That was it. He didn't wait for someone else to open up Africa. He didn't wait for someone to invent a four-wheel drive vehicle. He didn't wait for others to build bridges and roads. He drew the first maps of the Zambezi River. David did not have an attitude of entitlement. He had a Protestant work ethic. And by the way, this map, which you can see framed in CLB downstairs, this map David Livingstone drew from the ground. He didn't have the benefit that we've got today of satellites, maps and all that. And he, from the ground, he would boil a tea with a thermometer in it and note where, at what temperature the water boiled to work out the altitude. He would take sextant readings, work out his latitude. He drew this map from the ground, walking along the banks. He couldn't afford the luxury of a canoe, to rent or buy a canoe to go down the Zambezi. He walked along the banks. And he drew a map which, when we compare it to our satellite images today, we say it's accurate. Isn't that extraordinary? Especially bear in mind, these are the kind of maps that existed before Livingstone. I use the word maps very vaguely and loosely. These were literally the maps of that time. At that time, when people spoke of Sudan, they would think of anywhere south of Egypt. It could even include India. They thought India was somehow linked to Africa. And you can't believe how inaccurate these maps were. The general view, by the way, of Africa was that Africa was one big desert on the inside. Well, you know, if you've been along the coast, you can see sometimes there's deserts. Namibia's got a lot of desert. Of course, North Africa. So the assumption was the whole hinterland of Africa was one big colossal desert. And if you go to the Kruger National Park today, you'll see they call these flat dogs in Kruger Park Nile crocodiles. Now, they've got nothing to do with the Nile. But when the Boers trekked up there and they saw these crocodiles, they thought the Limpopo was the headwaters of the Nile, and they assumed that we have Nile crocodiles in what today is the northern and western Transvaal. But obviously we're not. They literally thought the mountains of the moon, the source of the Nile, extended into what today would be Zimbabwe. And so this is Sebastian Cabot's map in the 16th century. And even this 1529 map of Africa, they think that the Nile River starts somewhere in Central Africa. And even this is a more advanced map. At about the time that Livingstone came to Africa, a lot of it was just unexplored territory, unknown. But Livingstone filled in a map and showed, no, the center of Africa is filled with rivers, mountains, lakes, and plateaus. It's, in fact, phenomenal farmland and so on. And he's the one who filled in the map. One day in 1855, Livingstone was traveling back from Angola across Africa, and he's coming down the Zambezi, mapping his way, and he sees this pillar of smoke in the distance. Asks the local people, what is it? That's Musi Oyatanya, the smoke that thunders. What makes the smoke thunder? Who knows? Spirits? Well, have you been there? No. Yeah, people are terrified of going near there. It can be a thunderous roar, and there was a view that this place was bewitched. He found the greatest concentration of wildlife he saw across all of Africa in and around the area of Victoria Falls, what he called Victoria Falls. And so he hired a canoe, and he went down towards what must be a waterfall. I mean, this must take nerves of steel. And he got close and he beached his canoe on that island, which today is called Livingstone Island. Just as well he stopped there. You don't want to go any further. Now, this picture's very imaginative. Yes, he did crawl to the edge, but there weren't people standing with spears behind him and on each side of him. No one wanted to come with him. They were too afraid. Livingstone crawled to the edge. There it is, Livingstone Island. He crawled to the edge and he was prepared. He had a weighted string with lead on the other end, dropped the string down 300 feet. And he's right. 300 feet down, that's the height of Livingstone, of Victoria Falls. Here's another view of Livingstone Island. Another view. Can you imagine crawling to the edge? You don't know what's on the other end. I mean, that's courage. So he got to the end, and this is his sketch, which you get an original of Livingstone's Travels. And I've got an original copy of Livingstone's Travels, just to give you an idea of the idiocy of our universities today. Inside, somebody said to me saying, I bought this at a book sale, I thought you'd be interested. Inside was University of Tennessee Library stamp, and then discarded stamp over it. $2 scratch in the top corner in pencil. So I then checked on Google or Amazon, what is a first edition Livingstone travel book worth? $2,000. University of Tennessee threw it out and sold it for $2. This is the idiocy we've got in our Institutes of Higher Learning today. Well, the original edition's got this map. Look at it. You can see he's got the details. 1,860 yards across. That's what it is. We can't improve on that stat. 310 feet deep. That's correct. 400 feet between this part of the gorge and the other. 150 paces there. And so you can see how he's mapped it out. This is just his rough sketch on the day. But how do you pace out a waterfall? I mean, you can't exactly walk across the waterfall. But how did he measure it? He didn't have the tools we've got. This is even more extraordinary. This is sketching in his first edition. Now, there is no elevation or hill where you can get this perspective. So it's hard enough to sketch what you see. He imagined himself above the falls to give you an idea of what it looks like. And this one's and that's what it is. That's what microlight can show you what Victoria Falls is today. This one is also remarkable, a Livingstone sketch. He positioned himself in his imagination above to show people the gorges that flow from Victoria Falls. But there is no place in which you can see this. But it's accurate. That's what it is. How did he pace this out? How did he measure it? It's just absolutely remarkable ability as a sketcher, as a scientist. And on his second missionary journey, Queen Victoria sent him Thomas Baines. Now you'll see these prints of these pictures we've got lining the entranceway into the upper room. Thomas Baines was the greatest artist of Victorian England. And Queen Victoria commissioned him to go and paint the falls named in honor, Victoria Falls. And so Thomas Baines shows massive amount of wildlife, huge herds, which had never been hunted before. There was still a wildlife sanctuary. Even years after Livingstone had discovered it, there's a second missionary journey, and the vegetation is so intense, obviously there's no shortage of water and rain. And Thomas Baines's artwork, you can enjoy looking at the prints that we've got afterwards, showed this is one of the great wonders of the world, one of 7 great natural wonders of the world, what we call Victoria Falls. Now, some people have scoffed, saying David Livingstone couldn't have discovered Victoria Falls. All the people knew about it. Really? Well, he's the first one to have named it, the first one to have measured it, and the first one to have made it known internationally. But there's the possibility that perhaps he was the first human being to see it. Despite there being people living in the interior, it's possible that the smoke that thunders so terrified people that superstitious people hadn't yet been liberated from witchcraft, who didn't know the gospel yet, were too scared to go there. So it's possible that Livingstone might have been the first to have seen it, but he certainly was the first to map it, sketch it, and make it known. And by the way, about the time that I first went to see Victoria Falls, I was 12 years old, and I remember seeing Devil's Cataract here, and that's the first of the falls. And we were all talking about the fact that some Italian film crew had gotten too close to the falls, and the whole film crew, that's the director, the producer, the whole lot, the cameraman, all went over Devil's Cataract. They must have got some spectacular pictures on the way down, but they were never seen again. I mean, that's really terrifying. This is Main Falls, or sometimes called Rainbow Falls. And you get different names of different falls all the way along. Now today you'll get some strange people going and getting selfies on the edge, and they've got like jacuzzi type rock pools where people pose and get pictures of themselves, and then, you know, a bit more gust of water comes and they get washed over. And so when I was there, they were talking about some silly tourists that gotten washed over the falls. And I asked the locals, does this happen? Has this happened before? And they said, often. Every year, the silly people get washed over the falls, getting too close and trying to get selfies. And maybe they got some good pictures on the way down, but anyway. I said, well, why isn't this ever published? He said, well, it's bad for tourism. So you don't talk about it. So on the 16th of November, 1955, they unveiled this classic monument to David Livingstone on the Rhodesian side of Victoria Falls, the 16th of November, 1955. I would sometimes say with my wife rolling eyes, saying I could never forget my wife's birthday. It's on the same day that David Livingstone discovered Victoria Falls, 16th of November. And it's a magnificent statue. Been there many a time, and notice David Livingstone standing. He's got his Bible in his left hand and his walking cane is right. Interestingly enough, Livingstone said one of the stupidest things he did was reading the Bible while hiking in the veld. As he's walking from Port Elizabeth up through Craignanet to get up to Kuruman, he was reading his Bible and he tripped. And in trying to protect his Bible that he's reading while walking, he broke one finger. And that recommends, you know, don't text while driving, don't read while walking. And so even then, that sort of accident can happen. This really communicates David Livingstone pretty well. I think this is a phenomenal work of art. To achieve what he did, Livingstone was decisive, he was goal-orientated, and he was inflexible. Reformed theology put doctrinal steel into his backbone. He would not budge. He was a man of integrity, a man of his word. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. He walked many thousands of miles across difficult, dangerous terrain to return his porters to their village. And the story is, he had walked across Africa. You've got to look at the whole map in some ways. He was criticized after one of his early missionary journeys because he came back with his wife sick, all of his children sick, and one of his children, young Elizabeth, had died in the field. And that was a mission in Botswana. He was criticized. How can you take your wife and children into the field? So his next real missionary journey, he walked to Cape Town, put them on ship, sent them back to Scotland where they could be looked after by family. Then he set out on his mission. And he was then criticized for leaving his family behind. On his second missionary journey, his wife joined him and died in the field of malaria. And he's criticized for letting his wife come with him on his third missionary journey. So it's like he couldn't do anything right. Everything he did, they'd criticize him for. But he walked all the way through Botswana, Zambia, and Angola to Luanda at the Atlantic Ocean. And there was a ship, the Forerunner, waiting to take him to England. He was already famous for what he had discovered and what he had already seen. And he could have been in England in a couple of weeks. He put a copy of his research and geographic documentations on that ship. Just as well, he didn't go on the ship sank with all hands lost all of his recordings, but fortunately they were a copy. He had made a copy. I mean, that's by hand. There were no Xerox machines back then, bear in mind. While he was in Luanda, he took his porters, who were all from Botswana, took them to a Catholic cathedral to see what a church service looks like. And the porter said, we see that the whites also seek to charm their demons. They thought that the Roman Catholic rituals and the smells and bells and incense and all this, that this was a witchcraft ceremony, which proved his point, being a Protestant, that he is able to say, yes, that's actually quite true. They are trying to charm their demons here. And the problem with Angola was it was under Portuguese. Now, all European countries had abolished the slave trade after the Napoleonic Wars, Treaty of Vienna, except Portugal. Portugal was the one country in Europe that still did slavery. And so Livingstone couldn't leave his porters in Angola in good conscience because they might get enslaved. So he said goodbye to the ship and walked across Angola, Zambia, to take his porters back home. I mean, how's that for a man of integrity? He didn't think of what was convenient for him. He thought of what was, and it might have saved his life on that occasion, by the way, because that ship sank. But then he decided, no, we're not just going to go back to Botswana, we're going to keep going. And it kept going all the way through to the Indian Ocean. And on the way, of course, mapped Victoria Falls and the whole Zambezi River. David Livingstone understood the power of prayer. He had Holy Spirit fire in his heart, soul, and mind, and he prayed and sang the Psalms daily. He had a great love for God's creation, for nature, and for wildlife. You can see it in his book. He's got so many sketches. His books are filled with intricate sketches, fascinating details of animals and vegetation, like the eland, the biggest buck in Africa, and the hippopotamus, who are actually quite dangerous. You may not think hippos are as dangerous as crocodiles, but actually hippos are more dangerous than crocodiles. Hippos kill more people every year in Africa than crocodiles do. Flat dogs get a bad press, but the hippos can be seriously bad-tempered. You bump your boat against them or something, they will turn around and crush your boat to pieces. And of course, you get the water bucks and the baobab tree. And the baobab tree is magnificent. You can make sandals, you can make rope. There's all sorts of things you can make from the baobab bark. And at the top of the baobab tree, there's normally some water, very stagnant water, but you can boil and purify it. And so the baobab tree can be a real source of life if you're hiking across the veldt. He recorded the different types of tools that he saw, like the double-handed Angolan hoe, the different types of body piercings and beautification things like enlarging lips and nose rings and whatever other piercings, bangles, the way how people use fish hooks with ash to make these bumps on their heads to make different types of markings to distinguish this tribe from another, and so on. Different types of interesting hairstyles. He noted the different musical instruments people were using and the different dances and ceremonies like this full moon festival, and how the Bushmen would use ostrich eggs as water bottles, and they would use nets to carry these ostrich eggs, which would be stuffed with some grass to fill up the hole, and they'd bury these water bottles in different places that they had water to come to when they were crossing deserts and so on. So, very observant. He walked across an Africa that had vastly more wildlife than we've ever seen in our lifetimes. And I still remember when I was young seeing herds of 400 elephants in a single place in Wankie. He would have seen bigger than that and greater than that. And of course the wildebeest, who like the motorbikers, like motorbike gangs of the wild. Massive herds that, I mean, can you imagine, you're not just seeing zebra crossings, but giraffe crossings. And all kinds of teeming wildlife. The buffalo is probably one of the most dangerous animals in Africa on land. And this is why Colonel Breitbach chose the buffalo to symbolize his 3-2 battalion. These are tough guys, and you don't want to get into a scrap with a buffalo. And of course, the crocodiles, what we called mobile handbags and flat dogs in Rhodesia. Hippos have rights of way in the water. Elephants have trunks, they can walk across the river with their trunk breathing above them as they literally walk on the surface of the river. Here, this has been done up at Trobe. Of course, the leopards. Now, it's amazing. David Livingstone walks amongst all these animals, these extraordinary animals, and he's seeing the Creator's handiwork, engineered for speed. Can you imagine seeing a cheetah in the wild? ready to spring into action. And the lions, he saw many lions. Now, David Livingstone is famous for having been attacked by a lion. But to be fair, while I'm normally on David Livingstone's side, on this case, I've got to speak up for the lion. Because there's a monument to him being attacked by a lion up at his birthplace in Scotland, and it doesn't even show the rifle, because Livingstone had been conned by the local chief into shooting a local lion. Probably the chief wanted a lion skin, and Livingstone had a rifle, so he talked him into shooting this lion, and the lion was minding his own business, lying on the rock, when Livingstone shot him, and the lion got up with the bullet in him, ran to Livingstone, grabbed him by the shoulder, crushed his shoulder, which hurt him for the rest of his life, shook him like a dog shakes a rat, and he puts it in like the medical observation of how he felt no pain at the time, thinks this is a mercy from the Creator, that probably a gazelle can't feel any pain when a lion grabs him. And just like if you come off your bike or you fall, you don't feel pain immediately, even if you cut yourself. There's a numbness for a while before the pain comes. And he thought there's a mercy from the Creator that numbs our pain, and that an animal being grabbed by a lion probably feels no pain before it even dies. And so he's actually observing symptoms in himself even. But he said, dumbest thing he ever did was shooting that lion. Every time it got cold, he felt his bones aching and all this. And, don't pick a fight to the lion. He was never attacked by a lion for the whole 26 years of his time in Africa, except the one time he shot the lion first. So, principle to learn there, leave lions alone and you won't get your shoulder crushed. By the way, when missionaries first reported to Europe, there's snow at the equator in Africa. They were dismissed as liars. How can you believe missionaries who lie like that? There's no way there can be snow at the equator. But then photography showed, yes, at the equator, there is snow on Mount Kilimanjaro and not far away at Mount Kenya, all year round. And the missionaries were right, and the people who dismissed them as liars obviously owed them a big apology. But imagine that, snow at the equator in Africa. You might be pouring with sweat on the savannah, but if you hike up, and it'll take you 5 days to hike up Kilimanjaro. It's 5,896 meters high. You get to the top and you will be seriously freezing.
Is it Mount Kenya or Mount Kilimanjaro?
I think that one might be Mount Kenya, yeah. But Kilimanjaro is a 5-day hike. And to think that you can have these wildebeest migrations of 1 million wildebeest in one herd moving, some in winter between what today is Tanzania and Kenya. Remarkable. And he saw that. Well, David Livingstone was inspired by a post-millennial eschatology of victory. He had a kingdom vision. David Livingstone understood the greatness of the Great Commission. He worked to comprehensively fulfill the Great Commission, seeking to minister to body, mind, and spirit. Now, as a medical doctor, he ministered to the body. As a teacher, he ministered to the mind. And as a preacher of the gospel, he ministered to the spirit. As shown here in this lovely stained glass window in Livingstonia. That's northern Malawi. I think, Frank, you've been there, haven't you? And here he is sowing the gospel seed in fertile ground in Malawi. Wherever he went, David used his medical knowledge and his training, his breadth of reading and his learning, and his deep faith and knowledge of the Holy Scriptures to enrich the people and to empower the people of Africa. This, by the way, is the flyleaf, or the first title page of his book, Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa. And when he says South Africa, he's thinking of the whole of Southern Africa, because the country of South Africa didn't exist then. You had the Transvaal, you had the Free State, you had the Cape, you had Natal, but you didn't have South Africa. And so South Africa term was obviously encompassing everywhere from the Congo, Angola, Mozambique down. And notice, he doesn't put a lion, he puts a tsetse fly on his flyleaf. Why? He said the biggest obstacle to the gospel in Africa is the tsetse fly. If you see pictures of David Livingstone riding on a horse with his porters carrying their bearings, that's total fiction. He didn't and couldn't ride on a horse. No horse could survive in the interior. Tsetse flies had picked him off, which is why they were using ox carts even to go from Barberton to Maputo. The tsetse fly picked off the horses, and the oxen didn't all survive either. You know, Jock of the Bushveld and all that. But the tsetse fly was so severe an enemy that Livingstone put that on the flyleaf of his book. And by the way, while we talk about tsetse fly, mosquitoes. Livingstone is the first person to have identified mosquitoes as the source of malaria. Now, the scientific community belittled him and ridiculed him. What does he know? Stupid fool. How on earth can insect cause malaria? Look at the etymology of the word. Malaria, bad air. Malaria is swamp fever. It's caused by swamp fever. What the solution is high ceilings. I remember growing up in Rhodesia, super high ceilings everywhere, because the goal was, let the bad air rise. You won't get malaria if you've got tall ceilings, right? And Livingstone says, no, mosquitoes cause it, but not just any mosquitoes. The pregnant female mosquito caused malaria. Now, I don't know how many of you have been bitten by mosquitoes, noticed whether it was male or female. I personally have not, but Livingstone was that observant. He was even more observant that not only was the pregnant female mosquito that caused malaria, but they only planted the eggs in you between midnight and about 4 or 5 in the morning. If you're under your mosquito net by 11 at night, and you only get out at about 6 in the morning, you won't get malaria. You may get bitten by a mosquito, but you will not get malaria if you're under your mosquito net from 11 at night to about 5 or 6 in the morning. And he's been proven right. But at the time, he was ridiculed as being unscientific. What did he know? Well, this is why Livingstone lived 26 years in the field, where the average life expectancy of a missionary in Africa at that stage was 2 years. Missionaries died sometimes within 3 months of landing in Africa. They called West Africa the missionaries' graveyard. But Livingstone not only recognized malaria as being caused by mosquitoes, but he discovered the cure. Now, for a time, he actually tried what the witch doctors and others tried, and he records the symptoms and how ineffective these were. So he decided that the witch doctors knew nothing about how to deal with malaria. And it so happened, when a ship was coming down from Europe to Cape Town, the George is the name of the ship, it had its foremast split in a thunderstorm, and they had to dock in Rio de Janeiro and go into the Amazon to find a good tall tree to chop down to make a new foremast. And while in the Amazon, he took clippings of different bushes and he found a quinine bush. And he brought the quinine bush all the way to Kuruman, grew it, tried some of the herbs there, and he discovered that's the perfect solution to malaria, quinine. And I remember seeing these. Livingstone's Rouser, quinine and rhubarb. We used to take these in Rhodesia for malaria. And it was called Livingstone's Rouser because Livingstone discovered that quinine is the solution to malaria. So how's that? 20 years before the scientific community caught up, he was ahead of the curve. He recognized the cause of malaria, and that's how he stayed in the field alive, despite having malaria more than 60 times, because he had the cure. He patented the cure. Well, imagine if he had patented, what kind of money he could have made. Gee. Actions speak louder than words. David Livingstone teaches us that your actions speak much louder than your words. What you say is not as important as what you do. He was described as a man of resolute courage. Fire, water, stone wall would not stop Livingstone in the fulfillment of any recognized duty, it was said. He was once known to walk miles to pay back tuppence that he had borrowed from somebody. Indeed, he didn't let swamps or rivers or deserts or mountains stop him from opening up Africa for the gospel. So he overcame phenomenal obstacles. David Livingstone was determined to make a difference. The Great Commission was his supreme ambition. Christ's last command was his first concern. He wrote, I hope to be permitted to work as long as I live beyond other men's line of things and plant the seed of the gospel where others have not planted. Another quote from Livingstone, I'm a missionary heart and soul. God had an only son, and he was a missionary and a physician. A poor, poor imitation of him I am or ever wish to be. In his service I hope to live, in it I wish to die. I shall open up a path into the interior or I will perish. May God bless us and make us blessings even unto death. Shame upon us missionaries if we are to be outdone by slave traders. If the slave trade can reach a tribe, so we can with the gospel too. Battling rains and chronic discomfort, rust, mildew, rot, totally drenched and fatigued, laid low by fever countless times. Livingstone continued to persevere across the continent. Trials tested the tenacity of the travel-weary team. Often Livingstone endured excessive, unnecessary suffering, deprivation, hacking through dense jungle on foot, because lack of funds prevented him from affording the luxury of a canoe. These privations, I beg you to observe, are not sacrifices, he wrote. I think that word ought never to be mentioned in reference to anything we do for him, who, though he was rich, yet for our sakes he became poor. The challenge of Livingstone rings out to us today. Can that be called a sacrifice, which is simply paid back as a small part of a great debt owing to our God, a debt which we can never repay? It is emphatically no sacrifice. Say rather, it is a privilege. And so he would rebuke people who spoke about a sacrifice. He said, it's a privilege to suffer for Christ. David Livingstone emphasized sacrificial service is more powerful than eloquent sermons. We need to put feet to our faith. Your best sermon illustration is a life of sacrifice. And Livingstone also alerted the world to the cancerous sore of the Islamic slave trade. It was missionary explorer David Livingstone whose graphic descriptions brought the ravages of the East African slave trade to light. This being one of his sketches showing an Arab literally axing a straggler. You've heard the stragglers will be shot, well here, stragglers will be axed. In his missionary travels, a narrative of an expedition to the Zambezi, that's the second missionary journey, he exposed the horrors of the slave trade. 2 of the women had been shot the day before for attempting to untie their tongues. One woman had her infant's brains knocked out because she could not carry her load and it. A man was dispatched with an axe because he had broken down with fatigue. These taken out of the country are but a small section of the sufferers. We never realized the atrocious nature of the traffic until we saw it at its fountainhead. There truly Satan has his seat. This is just one of the many atrocities he witnessed. This is in Ujiji, where Arab slave traders just started opening fire on the people. Besides those actually captured, thousands are killed and die of their wounds and famine, driven from their villages by the internecine war, waged for slaves and for their own clansmen and neighbors. Slain by the lust of gain, which is stimulated, be it remembered always, by the slave purchasers of Cuba and elsewhere. David Livingstone taught you cannot be neutral in the battlefields of life. He had the courage to confront evil. His fearless faith fought the good fight of faith. He set many thousands of captives free. Submit to God, resist the devil, he will flee from you. Of course, he is criticized for this, which is why, and some of these modern textbooks just leave all this controversy out. But when somebody criticized him for shooting at slave traders, he said, I love peace more than any man. In fact, I'm quite beyond you in this. I'm willing to fight for peace. And he said that when you see poisoned arrows and spears and gunshots fired at you, more light will enter your mind, or more daylight would enter your body if you do not learn to respond. When Arabs are shooting at you, you've got to shoot back and things like this. So David Livingstone's an extraordinary example of patience, perseverance. I mean, imagine taking 7 months to reach your mission field. Talk about patience. I get impatient at waiting a day at an embassy. To think of 7 months, just extraordinary. He overcame every obstacle and he walked across the continent of Africa. Sometimes you see very unfair portraits of Livingstone being carried by his bearers, but that's in the last months of his life when he was dying. He walked everywhere. He wouldn't let anyone carry him until he was so sick with fever that he couldn't resist. He walked from Delgoa Bay, what today is Port Elizabeth, all the way through Graaff-Reinet, which he called the prettiest town in Africa. He stayed in the Andrew Murray home, not that he met the young Andrew Murray, because the young Andrew Murray was studying overseas at that time, because he walked through in the 1840s. But he met Andrew Murray Sr., and he went up to the Northern Cape, to Kuruman. He walked across today is Botswana, all the way across the Cape Colony to Cape Town, to place his family on a ship to return to Britain. And by the way, his observations on Cape Town are not flattering. He said the people in Cape Town are supremely selfish, materialistic, just involved in balls and dances and unconcerned about the millions of people who haven't heard the name of Christ, not that far from where they are. And so he was not impressed with the Cape Town churches. He preached in Kloof Street at the Congregational Church there. They've got his desk as the communion table to this day. And David Livingstone walked all the way across Botswana, Zambia, Angola to the ports of Luanda. And by the way, while he was walking across the continent, he mapped an ideal cross-section of Africa, working out the heights and the different types of soil and the different types of rocks. So it's a geological cross-section of the continent. And that's also in the first edition of the Livingstone's Travels book, which was thrown away by the University of Tennessee. He walked across what today is Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, to the Indian Ocean. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And much of these calculations he took while he was sick. Even when he was sick, he didn't stop. He came back, he explored much of the Zambezi River, the Shiri River, the Ruvuma River. He walked across what is today Mozambique, Malawi, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. Yet in all these things, we are more than conquerors through Christ Jesus who loved us. By the way, after his first missionary journey, he arrived in England and he was the hero. He was wined and dined by the Geographic Society, given medals, received into Buckingham Palace by Queen Victoria herself. He was the hero. But then, to be fair, the context is Britain had just had the disastrous Crimean War, and they were looking for a distraction. And so he was the distraction. When Livingstone left on a second missionary journey, there was nobody with him. Nobody saw him off to the docks. He left alone. And he came back from a second missionary journey, maligned. Nobody welcomed him because he'd been spoken badly of by his co-workers. So after the first missionary journey, Queen Victoria sent the dream team out with him. He had the top artists, Thomas Baines, he had Dr. Kirk, he had all kinds of the best in a different field. He had a Royal Navy vessel he had, which chewed up so much wood and coal that they had to spend days scavenging just to get enough fuel to let this steamer operate. But nevertheless, every one of the Europeans with him gave up and went home and then spoke behind his back. Livingstone's impossible to work with, he's insane, all sorts of things. Livingstone never had a problem with the Africans, but he really didn't like the Europeans. And he said all the Europeans he dealt with, they were lazy, indolent and so on. And they were like, Livingstone's a slave driver, he's insane. And one of the problems was Livingstone had a prescription for if you've got fever, he said the best way to deal with fever is sweat it out, work harder. So Dr. Livingstone's prescription for fever was work harder. No bed rest, no day off, no getting sick leave. So the guys just all turned against him, even his brother. They all went back to England and gave bad reports to the press. So when Livingstone came back from a second missionary journey, nobody wanted to see him, hear him, and he left on his third missionary journey with not a single soul to take him to the ship. Nobody waved him off. Last time England saw him, there was apathy. It's like he is yesterday's hero. And that's when an American newspaper sent out Henry Morton Stanley to find this lost British explorer, who was not lost. He knew where he was, but nobody in the outside world knew where he was. And that's just an interesting point, that Livingstone he's a difficult man to work with, for sure. But he achieved things that the others didn't. On his third great missionary journey, he walked across the whole length of Tanzania, much of Mozambique, Malawi, Zambia, Congo, Burundi. He finally died on his knees in prayer in the province of Luapula in northern Zambia. And in his 30 years of dedicated missionary service, he walked from coast to coast across what are today 12 vast countries. And he walked across a continent that didn't yet have any roads or bridges or purified water. I shall try to hold myself in readiness to go anywhere, provided it be forwards, he said. So David Livingstone teaches us the power of the printed page. It is books that he read, like Practical Christianity by William Wilberforce, that channeled much of his life in dedicated labors to eradicate the slave trade and to open up Africa to the gospel. He was a young man when he wasn't even 12 years old when he had read William Wilberforce's Practical Christianity, and he decided, I'm going to be that kind of Christian. He wrote missionary travels, the Zambezi expedition, and his journals, which we have first editions of here in this mission. We've even got a couple of Livingstone's travels books right here. Yep, I see some of them. Livingstone travels in a Zambezi expedition are right here. He inspired generations of missionaries to dedicate their lives to winning Africa for Christ. Livingstone's steadfast example inspired Mary Slessor to devote her life to Calabar, what is present-day Nigeria. And by the way, if Livingstone had a poverty-stricken background, Mary Slessor had worse one. If it's possible to have been more poverty-stricken and disadvantaged than Livingstone, Mary Slessor was it. Livingstone still had a father who loved him. Mary Slessor had an abusive drunkard of a father, and she had to go out and work for the whole family early on because her father wasn't doing anything except spending money on drink. So Mary Slessor was also a cotton mill worker, and she was also somebody who was destitute, but much worse than Livingstone. And by the way, Henry Morton Stanley was even more poverty-stricken and disadvantaged than Mary Slessor. Even his mother threw him away. I mean, Henry Morton Stanley was brought up in abusive foster homes, the wrong word. What was the orphanage? Orphanage where he was beaten, thrashed, abused by a very sadistic type person. And so Henry Morton Stanley didn't even have a mother. At least Mary Slessor had a mother who cared for her. And then Peter Cameron launched the Africa Inland Mission as a result of Livingstone's example. Peter Cameron returned from Africa in failure after his first mission. But when he read the inscription on the tomb of David Livingstone in Westminster Abbey, "Other sheep I have which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice," Cameron was rebuked, inspired, and he returned to Africa and established what today is the biggest mission and church in Africa, the African Land Church, African Land Mission. If you go to Westminster Abbey, which I have, you'll see that Livingstone's tomb is at the premier spot at the entrance to Westminster Abbey. When William and Catherine were married, they had to walk around Livingstone's tomb on the way into Westminster Abbey. It is in the premier spot. Isn't that amazing? Livingstone knew the power of the printed page, and he knew the power of public speaking tours. He focused on universities as strategic for mobilizing reformers and missionaries to fulfill the Great Commission. Livingstone saw the rivers as God's highway to reach Africa for Christ. We'd see rivers as obstacles. They're major obstacles for us if there's no bridges. Let me tell you, to get across rivers is quite a challenge. But he saw it as God's highway to reach Africa for Christ, which I think is what's inspired our missionary, Johan Menkes, who's in the Congo right now, seeing the Congo River as a highway to reach these people who are unreached. All communities need access to water, so rivers are a strategic artery for missionaries to utilize to fulfill the Great Commission. David Livingstone believed in leadership training. In fact, his vision was to establish Bible colleges for Africans to be trained as evangelists and teachers and missionaries to disciple the nations. London Missionary Society dismissed this as unrealistic and just swept it off the table. There's no way that's going to happen. You know, Livingstone was way ahead of his time. So the life and legacy of David Livingstone has taught me the importance of discipline, exercise, reading, a Christian work ethic, temperance, self-control, self-denial, and to be duty-oriented. His Reformed theology has put doctrinal backbone, or doctrinal steel in my backbone, and taught me the importance of being a man of your word. You must be a person of integrity. We need to, when we give our word, we must do it. Many a time I've come to the field and they have been so surprised, you came back and you came back when we planned it. They said, you come back and we're going to have all these seminars and leadership training things organized. And then they were shocked when I turned up and they hadn't planned it yet because they didn't expect me to come back. They thought I was just saying things, nice things and promising what many people had come before. They make promises, but they don't fulfill it. And do you think people are surprised when a missionary actually keeps to his word and his commitment? That is a pity, but that's the way Livingstone was. Most importantly, he was a student of God's word. And the post-millennial eschatology of victory of David Livingstone has inspired me. We are not working at uncertainty. The Lord who gave us the Great Commission will enable us to fulfill the Great Commission. His promises and his power are fully sufficient to empower his church to fulfill his Great Commission, to make disciples of all nations, to teach obedience to all things that he has commanded. And David Livingstone's comprehensive vision of fulfilling the Great Commission ministering to body, mind, and spirit, has raised the standards of missionary service for all of us. It's a rebuke to religious tourism. And actions speak louder than words. Sacrificial service is more eloquent and more powerful than any eloquent sermons. We've got to put feet to our faith. We need to recognize we're in a world war of worldviews. And I've got this picture here to remind us of something important. I've got an exhibit in our cabinet here too. Diamonds. David Livingstone studied geology. He knew exactly what every type of rock was. So I've got in this cabinet here a model of the largest diamond ever made, the Cullinan diamond. If you want to pass this around. The Cullinan diamond is just an example, but obviously that's a model, just in case anyone's attempted. It would be under something more serious than, that would be worth millions if that was real. But Livingstone, walking near Kuruman, came across diamonds. He picked them up and he threw them into the bush, and he said nothing about them. Now, we know about this because years later, when Henry Morton Stanley walked into the village at Ujiji on the banks of the Lake Tanganyika and said, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, some of the most famous words in current memory, Livingstone responded, yes. He lifted his cap slightly. Stanley shook hands. I thank God, doctor, that I've been permitted to see you. Livingstone replied, I feel thankful that I'm here to welcome you. And Stanley offered Livingstone a whole packet of letters from home. But Livingstone put them aside and said, I've waited years for these letters. I've been taught patience. Tell me what's going on in the world. So Stanley's a newspaper man. He gives an update. The Suez Canal's open. You can travel through the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. General Grant's President of the United States. The Pacific Railroad is across the continent of America now. And Prussia's defeated Denmark and France in war, a new superpower in Europe. The transatlantic cable has been laid. You can have immediate communication between Europe and America now. And diamonds have been discovered in South Africa. And Livingstone just nods. I wondered how long it would take them. So the story came out. Stanley dug it up. You knew there were diamonds there? Yes. Threw them in a bush. Why did you throw them away? He said, we were only starting the church amongst the Tswana. If diamonds had been discovered earlier, the Tswana would have been overwhelmed with vice. All the diamond mines would come in and you'd have every kind of bar and brothel and vice and gambling. And here we were still trying to start the church amongst the Tswana. So he saw the importance was, let's focus on the most important thing. I had discovered the pearl of great price. I'm not going to waste my life by being distracted by diamonds. And so he was asked, then why didn't you just take a couple home and sell them when you got to Scotland? No, he said, people knew where I worked. They would have torn the continent apart finding these diamonds. He didn't even take a couple of diamonds home to sort of supply a bit of a retirement fund for his family or something. Now, how's that for keeping the main thing the main thing? I've got the pearl of great price. I'm not going to get distracted and derailed into diamonds. That just shows you the kind of man Livingstone was. He also taught us Islam is a threat to faith and freedom. You cannot be neutral in missions. We need to confront evil. We need to fight the good fight of faith. Be bold, be brave, be courageous, be patient and steadfast. Persevere. Does he teach us about perseverance? Overcome every obstacle. Go forward in the faith. Never forget the power of the printed page. Invest in books. Invest in your mind. Read. Teach your people to love reading. Readers make leaders. A reading Christian is a growing Christian. Do not forget the schools, colleges, the universities. They are strategic. We must disciple the next generation to be faithful to God's word, effective in God's service. Think strategically how you can reach the nations for Christ. Make your life count for eternity. In the words of C.T. Studd, who had a similar heart and mind to David Livingstone, you only have one life. It'll soon be past. Only what's done for Jesus Christ will last. Or as William Carey put it, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. God is great. Honor God with great faith. So what would David Livingstone say to us today? I beg to direct your attention to Africa. I know that in a few years I shall be cut off from that country, which is now open. Do not let it be shut again. I go back to Africa to try to make an open path for commerce and Christianity. Will you carry out the work which I've begun? I leave it with you. Also heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send and who will go for us? And I answered, here, my Lord, send me. So, you will get the story of David Livingstone as one of the chapters in the Greatest Century of Missions, which is one of our best-selling books. There are 22,000 copies in print. This is a real example of how to put feet to our faith. And the vision of Africa for Christ is really Livingstone's vision. We started a website called Livingstone Fellowship specifically to try and bypass the fact that the Frontline Web was being blocked and banned in many Muslim countries. There were South Africans overseas working in Dubai and so on saying they can't access the Frontline website. It's blocked because we're known to be a mission that exposes Islamic atrocities and so on. And so the Livingstone Fellowship website only has Bible studies and sermons, especially the Old Testament survey, New Testament survey sermons. And we also set up the Livingstone 200 website, particularly in 2013, when we organized the Livingstone 200 events. We traveled all over Africa. In the 12 countries Livingstone administered, distributing 3.5 tons of Bibles and books. And we've got a Dr. David Livingstone Facebook page too. Now, our mission house is called Livingstone House for obvious reasons. Livingstone is probably the greatest friend Africa ever had and a great missionary example to us. He has monuments all over the world. In Scotland, of course, the scripture in hand, and he is an example of excellence to the Scottish people. Amazing how many great men have come out of Scotland. This is this horrible anti-lion slander against lions monument they've got in Blantyre, Scotland. You can't even see a rifle. I mean, this is just so unbalanced, making it out like the lion just attacked him and even attacked him from the back, which is not true. The lion attacked him front on. He had shot the lion attacked him face to face. Of course, Livingstone might turn his back because you don't want to have your front ripped up, hoping his back could absorb most of the anger. But this is a real unbalanced anti-lion propaganda statue. But it's very dramatic. Here's a monument at Ujiji. At this spot stood the tree where Henry Morton Stanley met David Livingstone, 10th November 1871. Zambia, in 1873, on the centenary of Livingstone's death, produced a stamp of Livingstone chasing the Muslim slave traders out of Zambia. Healed his hope and soul, taking the last words of Livingstone, speaking about the slave trade. And that was when Zambia was a secular humanist state under Kenneth Kaunda. But even they would honor David Livingstone more than probably Scotland or Great Britain. And then in Chitamba's village in Zambia, they have a memorial for, this is where David Livingstone died on the 1st of May, 1873. And they've got a monument there where the tree used to stand. This monument occupies a spot where formerly stood the tree at the foot of which Livingstone's heart was buried. His faithful followers, who'd been rescued from slavery, said, Livingstone's a great man, his body must be carried back to his people to be buried in his own land, but his heart belongs to Africa, so they buried his heart under the tree. Interestingly, if you go to Zanzibar today, the island which was the slave terminus for the Arabs, just off the coast of Kenya, on Zanzibar, they now have Christ's Cathedral, and it's built over the very spot where the slave market used to be. And I might say they've got a cross made from wood from the tree under which his heart is buried over the altar. At Livingstone House, we've got some of the best books on Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley, first editions. These are some of the crown jewels at the mission, so to speak, like the Zambezi Expedition, Stanley's in Darkest Africa, the life and ministry of David Livingstone, and the pictures I've shown in this PowerPoint, a lot of them are scanned from these books. These are super valuable. And his legacy, his letters, we've got books on his letters, a homeschooling textbook that I helped produce, David Livingstone, Man of Prayer and Action. When we went to Livingstone in 2013 for the Livingstone 200, I saw 8 monuments to David Livingstone in the town of Livingstone. And this is at the Livingstone School, at the Livingstone Museum, also at the Victoria Falls. This was erected by Zambia in 2005. Interesting, they might be pulling down statues around the world, but they're still erecting statues for David Livingstone. At the Livingstone International Airport is a lovely monument to Livingstone and Susie and Truma, two of his faithful followers who were with him to the very, very, very end. And notice the Bible in the right hand. Well, I hopefully wasn't trying to read while walking. You can go to obscure places in Africa and see historic tree. Under this tree, David Livingstone rested while traveling from south to north. And so the Livingstone 200 was an event we sponsored and promoted, showing Christian films all over where Livingstone first preached, following up and carrying on with the legacy that he planted. But we cheated. We drove. We drove where Livingstone walked. So when I've had some of our people complaining about the bad roads, I say, guys, we drive where he walked. There's nothing to complain about. But this was one magnificent bicentenary that we were able to be part of, and renaming the mission house here, Livingstone House, was one of the ways in which we sought to honor this great missionary. These are events that we had in Zambia, where we had even the mayor's office and national TV coming and covering it. So at this occasion, it was the hottest day imaginable, 16th of November, 2013. And the Livingstone Teacher Training College. Here you can see Zambian TV turning out to cover our event. It was so hot, people were sitting under umbrellas and taking off their jackets, and I was told, don't you want to take off your jacket? I'm like, no. I said, I don't think I can honor David Livingstone by stripping off my jacket. He walked across Africa wearing jacket and tie, for goodness sakes. I'm not going to be a wimp here today. But I was so wet from sweat. If I jumped into Zambezi, I couldn't have gotten any wetter. My socks, everything was saturated. I was totally, totally drenched. Everything, you can't see it from here, but that suit was as wet as it could be. And next day, in better conditions, this is the local Anglican church, St. Andrew's. But we've still got all our missions conference sermons and other great materials on that commemorative conference in Zambia. These are Livingstone shoes, boots, had to be repaired a few times en route. His signature, website, book.